Thank you very much, Adam. The problem with working at Boku is that you might think that he just puts on the pun thing for conferences. That's not true. It is constant. But no, seriously, thank you very much for the introduction. As he said, my name's Adam White. I'm here to talk about side projects. Because it's still the morning and because I rarely stand in front of 200 to 300 odd people, there's two things I wanted to do first. First, a round of applause for the organizers, Tracy and Charlie and everyone. Cool. Now I've got a photo of me up here and you applauding, so even if my talk is awful, I'll be fine. The other thing is, I just tweeted out a link to my slides. I also tweeted out a link to the Red Cross. I don't know if you heard about the earthquake in Nepal this weekend, but the death toll's gone over 4,000. They can use some help. So with that out of the way, side projects. What is a side project? We probably all have some notion of what these are. They're pretty pervasive. But before I go any farther, let's take a moment and actually try to define this in a way that's specific to my talk today. I'm going to talk about side projects as any self-contained project that is not your main deliverable. I'm going to define it that way, partly to allow for things that are not code, partly for things that are not the web. I sent out, as Adam mentioned, a survey. I've been collecting data on people's side projects, people talking about the stuff they do. And I've gotten everything from Arya Stewart's HTML5 parser written in Node all the way to John James Jacoby's bathroom shower. It's not actually his shower. His shower, he said, was a disaster still. So we're not limited to the web. We're not limited to code. And with that context, I'd like to get a show of hands from you fine folks for who has maintained or worked on some sort of passion project or side project. Sweet, I'm done. You all know what's going on here. It should be, it's most of you. Most of the speakers at this event, and maybe not the majority, but a lot of them have been talking about work that they did that started out as a side project. Rather than try to explain to you, most of whom just raised your hands, what a side project is and why you might do them, I think I'm going to focus today on what we gain from side projects and how we can take some of the mentalities around them and apply them to the other work that we do, the center work, potentially. So I have a lot of content. I'm going to breeze through the why pretty quickly, but it sounds like that's copacetic given the response of the audience. Why would you do a side project? For me personally, it's all about the fame and money. That's mainly, you set out to do a side project, you're aiming to capture something like a quarter of the internet, right? Like that's why you sit down at the computer and start to write something like WordPress, or to fork it in this case. It's facetious, that's definitely not true. Almost nothing starts that way. In WordPress's case, Matt Mullenweg was using a blogging tool, B2 Cafe Log, and the maintainer disappeared, went off the internet for a while. And he was worried about forward compatibility. So he and another guy, Mike Little, forked the project, and because it was GPL, they were able to do that and keep using it. And in his announcement post back from 2003, said it'd be really great if someday this could have flexibility and ease of setup and parsing. Someday, right? That's probably not going to happen. But now we're at the point where WordPress does power 60% odd, according to W3 Tech, of the CMS market, which is, that's pretty humble beginnings for something that has grown so big. And all of that starts not because we're setting our sights on this goal, but because side projects are fun. They call them passion projects for a reason. I've heard people refer to taking on something that's sort of personally engaging as scratching an itch. I've heard it as just blowing off steam. Maybe you're trying to do something different from your work. And definitely moving away from work or complementing the work you do at work is a common theme. If we look at work problems, things that you deal with on a daily basis in your role, and fun problems, there's always going to be a lot of stuff that's interesting that you're not necessarily going to have time to do. For example, a lot of us don't have the ability to work in VR, but I think a lot of us got a bunch of stuff out of Rudy's talk yesterday. And I certainly left being interested in trying that out. I tried an Oculus Rift at the end of March and got simulation sickness. It was awesome. And it doesn't mean that working on something that's fun but outside of the work circle isn't valuable to us. We still gain new skills. I've heard this referred to as sort of plus equals on a couple of the blogs that I read of people talking about why they work on these types of things. My colleague Jen Schiffer definitely reiterated that when we were talking about her project, Make 8-Bit Art. She said that she took it on in part to get a better sense of JavaScript in the browser and of using Canvas and the Canvas APIs. And it turns out to be a really great tool, a really engaging tool, and it was a learning process for her as well. Similarly, John Chrétien from Spotify, formerly The Times, always tries to marry something he wants to learn with a passion. In the same way that Jen took art and tech that she wanted to learn. In this case, he's using D3 to visualize Shake Shack's custard calendar. He's got a bunch of these projects. I think they're pretty great. And it's by marrying these learning experiences with your hobbies, you gain a lot of motivation to build something, and you might have a ton of ideas for what to build. Of course, in addition to learning, you can solidify existing skills. This is a major reason why I do things personally. A lot of the time, it might not be to try to learn something new in isolation, but to combine it with a baseline. The same way that you can combine a technology you want to learn with a passion area of yours, you can combine one technology you want to learn with one you know already to minimize the risk of the project and sort of picking greenfield technology. I did this with a project that I launched this winter in Boston when the winter was destroying our subway system called MBT Awesome, which is trying to sort of take an upbeat spin on the disaster of transit that we had. And I used some tools I was familiar with, Express and Browserify, and I used some tools that I wasn't, Nunjux, the Jinja-derived templating from Mozilla, and Browserify, which I'd heard a lot of people talk about and wanted to give a go. And the great thing about these projects is that if we keep them small, we can iterate and we can start learning and seeing what tools work for us and what don't. For example, I learned that I really enjoy using Browserify. And if I were to do the same project again, I would probably take and I'd use Combine, a different templating language that plays slightly better with Browserify out of the box, and Ampersand, which is basically Backbone blown up into individual NPM modules. Ampersand also has runtime type checking. So if you enjoyed the presentation on type checking yesterday, you can check it out. It's not going to do any sort of that static analysis stuff, but it is kind of nice to be able to whitelist and type the values that a Backbone model can take, or Ampersand model. So is this repetition the point? Is it that practice makes perfect? Not necessarily. You definitely build muscle memory in a way. You definitely develop these tool chains. I've basically got a stack that I will apply to any project that I want to do that involves a server at this point, just because I'm very familiar with Express and it's very easy to stand up compared to some of the other options. But practice also reveals pain points and friction, things in your code and in your process and in your working method that are continual stumbling blocks. If you encounter the same challenges over and over again, you might want to take some effort to try to fix them. For example, if you, like Ben Allman, maintain several million jQuery plugins and have to do the same things every time you want to lint and test and release them, eventually you'll decide to start trying to abstract that problem, and it becomes an interesting problem, and you end up building something like Grunt, which is exactly where Grunt came from. He told me to caveat that he only actually had about 30 or 40 jQuery plugins, but definitely this was a common problem that he encountered that became an abstracted solution that was broadly applicable. But there's a lot of reasons to do side projects and to sort of dive down these rabbit holes, but they do cause various challenges to arise, both things that block you from completing the project to your satisfaction and things that might keep you from being able to work on the project at all or for the project to succeed. One of them, which we touched on yesterday, is the risk of exposing your work publicly. A lot of us might work within companies where we're dealing with a fairly sort of safe public persona of our company, but then when we put our own work out there, whether it is artistic or technical, we expose ourselves to criticism. If, for example, your work is useless, starts posting on your repo about how wretched your code is and why would you even release it, this is a problem that my colleague Tyler Kellen has talked about a lot, that the empathy and the ability to deal with these negative people online is the most draining part of a lot of what he does, particularly on GitHub and Twitter. When someone puts their worst foot forward, it can really be a stumbling block for your project. It takes a little bit of the wind out of your sails. But there are a lot of benefits to the public sphere as well, and the same way that showing art can gain people sort of building connections with you over that expression, having technical work out there on GitHub does give people the opportunity to collaborate with you and to work with you. This is really great advice that Tyler has given me, saying basically if someone submits good code and submits a clean PR, just like, obviously, if you're doing something like WordPress, you don't give them the big green button immediately, but if it's a small project, if it's something that you're still managing, it's very, very little reason not to let them go ahead and become a committer, because that's a major benefit, that's a major gesture of goodwill on their part to have put the code forward, and it's a reciprocity of goodwill to let them dig in, and it almost always pays off. Certainly, with a lot of projects that I've talked with people about, as their interest in them has waned, the fact that they've handed over some of those reins to other people can keep that going beyond its initial gestation. The biggest stumbling block, though, on getting anything done in a side project is always time. How do you make the time? They can take a lot of time, and when I ask people, when do you work? For example, Marika, who presented this morning, said mostly weekends, especially Sunday afternoon and night. I guess it's good we gave her an early Monday morning talk slot. And Saturday night at home, Leo Balter, nights and weekends. Almost everybody said nights and weekends somewhere. I put a survey out, and almost every one of those columns, if I'd done a word cloud, it would have been nights, weekends, everything else. But because of this, we begin to see some friction arise around that process of trying to find time. For example, Calvin here is saying that the time that he ended up putting into his side project, he'd originally earmarked to be working on something else that had given rise to it. So he suddenly starts dealing with the second problem rather than the first. This is definitely something that Ben reiterated, and with Grunt, he basically didn't have time to maintain those jQuery plugins. If anyone's up for maintaining a jQuery plugin, he's got a bunch of them because he just sort of got subsumed by Grunt. And it was pretty much the only thing he did for a long, long time. Nights, weekends, time between class, lunch, time between putting down a fork and picking up the knife, basically all the time. And side projects, depending on their scope, might never be done. Greg Smith published an online role-playing game called 91. Big, open world, narrative, potentially endless. And Jen mentioned that she doesn't have a lot of time to put into Make 8-bit art necessarily. She's got a lot of other things, a lot of other projects conflicting with her time. So it's difficult to put a lot of energy into something, to put it out in an, to you, unfinished state, and then potentially never be able to revisit it. And again, Ben cautioning that if you let this take over your life, you can really ruin your work-life balance. Because if you're working in the rest of your life, then it just becomes work, and that tends to drain people. I love this quote from Fembot on Twitter: "You are what you make time for." The fact that we have the opportunity to work in the field that we do, and we have the opportunity largely to continue to explore either artistically or technically on the side is really great. And the fact that we can choose and pick what projects we want to spend time on helps us define our areas of interest. It helps us learn new skills that we can take to other fields, and it helps us do our own jobs better. Fembot herself is working on a project called 25x52 to do 25 projects over the course of a year. This is one of them, a Google font typography showcase based around Google Web Fonts and passages from Fables. But this is just one of many projects, and each one is on a 2-week calendar. That 25, 52 weeks, 2 weeks each roughly. This is very deliberate, and it is in order for her to be able to build a habit through repetition and to have regular milestones that will continue to reinforce that behavior. This is, I think, really good advice, particularly if you're looking at the space of fun, interesting projects you could take on and the very limited amount of time you might have to work on them. Being able to sort of get it to a point you're happy with, and then move on to something else is very fulfilling because it lets you continue to experiment and to grow without getting trapped in any one silo. So as I mentioned, regularity and repetition are not necessarily skills that are limited to technical things. Certainly if you're doing any sort of woodworking, mechanics, art, all of these things benefit from practice. My art teacher in college gave me one of the best pieces of advice anyone's ever given me, which is basically go to your studio every day. If you rephrase that to not be art specific, in this case, he's saying even if you go in to just wash your brushes, being an artist ends up having a lot of administrative work, a lot of desk work, a lot of contacting people, trying to figure out where you're going to show your stuff. That can really take over, but if you can get yourself into that creative place, that place where you set in to work on your project in the first place, the reason you got up that morning wanting to do it, if you can get even a little bit of that done, it keeps your momentum going and it keeps you fresh for the next time. If you wait too long to go back to the studio, if you wait too long to go back to a project, you've lost context. You might not have the energy you did when you started. You might have gotten distracted with something else. And there's nothing wrong with dropping a project and picking up something else, but if you continue to only do that, this is definitely a trap I've fallen into where I end up building nothing. The best blog post that I've seen about it in our space was John Ressig's Write Code Every Day. He noticed that he was finding a lot of times he was not completing projects because he was waiting for a window of opportunity, a long runway in order to work on them, and those were never happening because we have busy lives. So he set himself some rules. Write code every day. Make it useful code. You're not just switching your tabs to spaces or indenting ternaries or anything. You're actually trying to add a feature. You're trying to do something that's going to move the project forward. And everything has to be written before midnight, so you don't put it off into the wee hours of the morning and then off to the next day. I've definitely been guilty of this, particularly putting these slides together. And the code, in his case, must be on open source and on GitHub. I think that's sort of a personal thing. Some people want to share it. Some people like the accountability that comes with it. Certainly, I envy his contribution graph. But a lot of other people might want to keep that more private, or might want to have their Saturday and Sunday lanes completely white and not have to worry about it. It's just a personality thing. And finally, if you're doing that regular thing, it's good to set yourself some deadlines. It's good to bring those milestones in the same way that Fembot's doing 2-week sprints effectively for her project. Mariko was saying in her talk that she found submitting this project to a conference to be a really motivating thing for having everything pulled together and reaching out to people and getting the work done to a point where it was presentable. Adam Sontag, our wonderful MC, also mentioned that he had the same experience building a web audio demo for the Queens.js meetup. He said, quote, "You put just enough time into it to get it done beforehand." That's really all you need, because then it's presentable and then it's out there. And if you want to, you can continue with it, and if you don't, you can move on. The complement to deadlines is scoping yourself well. If you begin to rabbit hole on one particular problem, it can be difficult to remember what your original objective was. Whereas if you try to set yourself regular feedback loop milestones, this gives you a little bit more ability to hit those things and keep yourself going. This is a quote from Eric Lewis, a developer at the Times, who built a cool text converter, as it's called. It's basically you enter a string and you can convert it to upside down Unicode characters, or you can do different transformations to it. And he added a couple different dialects to this, the upside down transformation being one of them, and he treated each one as effectively a one-day release. And this was how he continued to work on small increments so that he could have that satisfaction of getting something out there and then continue to move forward. And then the great thing about that, particularly if you use GitHub issues, my colleague Tim Branyan will always leave himself absurdly detailed GitHub comments and issues, issue text. If someone opens a bug, he'll write practically a novel about it, on the thought that he's done that time to get the investigation done. He might roll off, he might work on something else, he might work on one of his other projects, and it might be a while before he comes back. So parceling out your tasks in good chunks lets you be a little bit more asynchronous about it. It lets you multiplex those streams together. So work regularly, work incrementally, work towards a deadline. These are all sort of good habits to build for us to be able to get the most out of the time we put into our side projects. But I would like to make the argument in the rest of the time that I have that our side projects don't necessarily need to exclusively exist on the side. I think there's a lot of value in taking that energy and that passion and bringing it to potentially tangentially related things within your day job, within your main line of work. And that doesn't mean that you don't work on side projects on the side as well, but hopefully by beginning to move some of that time into work, you both get better at what you do and avoid some of the work-life imbalance that we've struggled with. These are a number of ways that companies around the world have embraced this idea. We've got X% time hackathons, project nights, game jams. Google in particular got very famous for this notion of 20% time that led to some of their projects like Gmail, and it was this amazing thing they were doing in the valley to allow engineers to explore and to grow and to have it all benefit the company too. This is not a new idea. This goes back to the 60s, and it's not Silicon Valley specific. The notion is called bootlegging. Basically, this is from Wikipedia, just research in which, I love the phrasing, individuals secretly organize the innovation process. As far as my research, I've not talked with a ton of people from Google, but it seems like that process was never officially sanctioned. And in 2013 or whenever, when they said they were cracking down on it, everyone got up in arms. But it had never really been official policy. Bootlegging almost never is. That's why it's called bootlegging. And the great thing about it is that if people are doing this exploration, it's really, the important thing is to sort of endorse it tacitly as an organization. So you're not saying like, you go build Gmail, because that doesn't work. That's not how innovation happens. That's not how people get excited to work on a project. Someone pointing a finger at you and saying, build it, doesn't tend to motivate people. Or it might, but not in the same way that like, ooh, I have a good idea, it does. Post-it notes, which we use on Scrum boards, and which we've built countless drag-and-drop systems to emulate, I'd say insufficiently, were actually a product of this type of process, where at 3M, there was a sort of R&D time endorsed through this permitted bootlegging policy. It eventually got renamed to 15% time around 98. There was a Wired article talking about the success they have. This, of course, several years still before Google. And again, it's rarely official. I was talking with Tim yesterday after his talk about some of the stuff that he's done on Tumblr. He was asking, like, how do you find time to make all of these amazing projects? He said, well, Tumblr is very nonchalant about it. And this doesn't mean that he's sitting there at Tumblr going, I'm going to build an elevator thing that has music. But it does mean that if he has an idea for something that's interesting that can benefit the Tumblr dashboard, he can submit a PR, and it will be reviewed, and it will be given due consideration, which I think is really cool, that they will hear you out. This is basically the theme of all of this, is that if you're doing the exploration, I mean, everyone, not everyone necessarily, but a lot of people will like take 5 minutes to read JS Weekly and have a cool idea and sit down and code on it. It's really good to sort of acknowledge that that's happening and to be okay about it. I'll get a little bit back into that later on. Hackathons are another kind of company-sanctioned exploration time that happens a lot. This one's a little bit different because instead of being as autonomous, you're working in a team, and this tends to be seen as like a good team-building exercise and maybe a way to repay technical debt or try to do a prototype. Awesome from a how can we move a project forward standpoint. Not quite as effective for personal satisfaction or like, I want to go and do this thing, but if you do it right, you'll be able to say, well, we need to pay off our technical debt, and also I really wanted to explore Browserify, so our AMD build is weird. Let's take a step back and try to do something about that. Project nights are a little bit separate. In my experience, these tend to be slightly more employee organized, not necessarily things that the company will set aside time for. The best example that I've heard of was a point-of-sale software and hardware company in Boston had a hack day to build vacancy indicators for their restrooms because they had about 80 people in 2 restrooms. And they had one of their engineers just sort of set up a hack night after work one day, and the company ordered pizza and said, fine, go have fun. But a bunch of their software engineers learned how to solder and learned how hardware worked and learned a little bit about how to interface with these machines from a computer. And given that they're writing software that's designed to talk to a device that's plugged into a phone to take your payment, this is really important familiarity and awareness to have, and it was entirely self-organized. The important thing is that it was endorsed in some fashion by the company, but not necessarily motivated by them. We've had art nights at Boku, which kind of take that in the opposite direction and are just more about having fun, but there's a spectrum here, and I think they're all equally valued. Adam mentioned that he and I work for Boku. We are a web technology company in Boston. I think we do a couple things in this space pretty right, and I'd like to share what we do and the success we've seen from it very briefly in the few minutes I have left. We have this notion of perch time. We're a consulting company. There's downtime between projects. And we have the ability to, once we finish up a consulting effort, take a step back and work with each other internally to build some internal tools that we use to keep our business going. It lets us try new technology. It's how a lot of people in the organization have learned about ES6 modules and some of the new syntax that's coming. And it also continues to directly feed back into our business by giving us a way to keep ourselves trained up and come out of it with technology that directly relates to what we do and our business goals. In a slightly more fun mode, we have this notion of Boku Fest, which is kind of our company week. We've done everything from set up an art show to, I think we did spray paint stencils and decorated our conference room with a big spray painted logo. My coworker Carl led a group to make a game for the Pebble Watch. Adam Sontag's done Easter eggs for Boku.com. This is kind of the blow-off steam period. We're kind of distributed, so we get together and we work together and we build fun stuff. So if Perch Time is a little bit more like a structured, project-oriented hackathon, this would be a little bit more like a project night or a game jam. We also have open source time. And I'm running out of time, but open source time is, I think, the most important thing we do. Every employee, by the handbook, gets a percentage of their time to maintain, contribute, and explore the open source technology landscape. This can be anything from building and releasing libraries to writing Twitter bots to learn how Node.js works. We're a consulting company too, as I mentioned, so this percentage doesn't come completely out of the time we would be spending on client projects. We might be using some of this time to work with them to take pieces of the code that we're working together on and find ways to abstract them and open source them to benefit both them and us long term. Also, I love this quote from my colleague Jim, that since he's always taken this time, by making it an official policy, he doesn't have to feel guilty about it. Not everyone takes the time, but we maintain a culture of trust and freedom through it. I don't share these because we're special in any way. We happen to be oriented around open source software, so I think it slightly lends itself a little better towards this model. But all of these things we do are things that other companies have done and had a lot of success by. We're basically taking the energy that we have as engineers and we're aligning our desire to explore and do sort of pick up one-off side projects with particular business goals and objectives we have. If we have freedom to explore, the theory goes, so far we've been largely successful. People don't leave as often. People sort of end up selling the company themselves because they enjoy working there. We've seen this with Google. We've seen this with ourselves. We've seen this with a lot of different organizations. Basically, this type of time is another type of professional development. No one thinks it's weird, or very few people think it's weird, that a developer can take 2, 3, 5 days off to go to a conference and to learn stuff. But at the same time, it seems to be, in some organizations, there's this hostility towards the notion that 30 minutes a day or so working on something is beneficial. But that's a lot less destructive to the projects you're working on than taking 5 days for a conference and then another 3 to catch up on all the email. So definitely look at it as professional development. Look at it as just another part of training and another part of your job. The last thing I want to share is this idea of projects within projects. Because we're very used to the notion of these highly parallelized worlds, we've begun to pull some of those mentalities into the work we do in our consulting. For example, I was leading a team last year to build a complex node application for a client, and we had this great research phase on the front, which is such a luxury on a project, particularly a greenfield build like this was, where we got to pick the tools we wanted to use and figure out how to solve their problems. And then as soon as we started building, other tasks started coming up that we hadn't researched. We could have taken a stop, we could have taken some time to sort of go back to the drawing board and see how things would integrate, but that wouldn't have allowed us to meet the deadlines we had. So instead, we kind of all scattered and we all built in a certain percentage of our time over the next week different prototypes about how to solve the problem, which in this case was how to get a good user experience for a blog authoring environment for a Node application, because this was beginning of last year. There still aren't a whole lot of really end-user editorially oriented Node CMSs. So we spun it off into a side project. I took this, I went back, I started working on a way to basically use WordPress as the authoring interface, but to publish everything via the new JSON REST API into our Node application so that the Node site can be entirely self-sufficient, but we can leverage the decade-odd of experience and UX that WordPress has developed. This was built alongside, and then it was slotted very neatly back into the project. And because we were working with the client on this, we were able to actually release both the package itself that we developed in order to do this, which we're continuing to maintain, not as much as I'd like, it's actually on my to-do list, and ExpressPress, which was a demo project. That was basically what we built in that week to prove that it would work. So by doing this together, sometimes the tools that you build on a project have a life long beyond the project itself. For example, who knows this logo? A couple people. How about this one? Slack has become huge, and Slack was what happened when the company that made Glitch stopped making Glitch. They'd built this internal tool, this really great communications tool, and when TinySpec pivoted, when they decided to shut down that game, they had something to take forward, and since then I think they've earned approximately all the money. So not all of these internal explorations are going to have millions of dollars of impact. This is one of Tim's. Just you can hover over the T in the Tumblr dashboard and it strobes different colors. It's just fun. It's not necessarily making them bank, but it makes the experience of using the tool better, and it continues to keep their users happy and engaged. Also, he says to watch this space. Big things are coming for that T, so he says. In closing, I think that we all have this sense that passion projects are important, whether they're technological, artistic, construction-oriented. I have a colleague who's been obsessed with building a podium. He's a carpenter. It's a priority for us as a company to give people time to explore those things, and I would really like to see that become a bigger part of our industry as a whole. To extend the art metaphor, no one thinks it's unusual that an artist keeps a sketchbook. It's seen as part of the practice. It's seen part of what they do. And it's bizarre to me that we don't make time to sketch within our own work, because we are in a creative profession. And I think that we should. I think it'll make us better developers, I think it'll make us better companies, and I think it'll strengthen the community as a whole, because so many of these events are driven and supported by people talking about the things that they do that they love. So, thank you.